Okay, a few of you. Just a little bit of background. I taught VOAG for 4 years, a long time ago, and continue to be involved. I have a son who is just graduated after 4 years. He was president of our local FFA chapter, and he started at Purdue. And his SAE experience was buying and reselling used farm machinery, and he worked full-time on a dairy farm. And I always held my breath every day he went down to work on the dairy farm. And then he and I raised cattle together, and we raised bulls. So that's another stressful experience. Anybody ever raised bulls? Okay, that's a good experience for you. And so he started pretty early in this whole process. So I think it's tainted me a little bit towards some of this discussion that we've had. But let me give a little background of where I'm coming from that might help you understand, maybe as it ties together sort of at the beginning. In 1978, we did the Indiana Farm Accident Survey. And one of the interesting findings of that survey, which was partially analyzed by a young guy by the name of Roger Tormolin, and some of you might know Roger, and he's currently head of our Ag Ed program at Purdue. And what we found is that kids in these 1,200 families who had completed the 4-H and FFA or VOAG tractor driving certification program were at greater risk of injury than those who did not. That was kind of interesting to me as an educator. And I really spent a lot of time on that and began to explore it. I remember talking with Raleigh Schneider at the time, and I said, we're going to publish this work. And he said, you better not, because the whole world has been operating on this program for a long time. And because he was much bigger than me. If you knew Raleigh, he was a pretty big chunk of guy. And so I made a mistake, and we never published that work. And I think Roger did a good job analyzing it. I was just out of college, or I finished my degree at Minnesota, and with George Copa, and he required me to take 12 hours of stat. It was a curse, but it was the first time I got to use it really well. And I kept redoing those numbers, and the process we used was much more complicated than it is today. But it still came up very clear that those kids were at greater risk. And then moving along, I had a workshop series that I did with our State Department of Health on promoting rural health issues. And my partner was a guy who was a full-time public health worker, and his area was smoking cessation. And so he and I would team up, and we'd go out and do these programs for extension homemakers. And then he would get in the car with me and smoke the whole time. Now, this does tie together at the end, okay? But, it just drove me nuts that here was a guy that would get up and talk this wonderful story, and he had you remember the jars with the human lungs in them? They're actually human lungs full of soot and garbage. And then he'd get in a car with me and smoked, okay? And then we started doing the gearing up material. And we had, 5 or 6 grad students go through working on this. Our expert was Brian French out of Washington State University, a really good educator and a curriculum development person. And one of the things we found was that in some of the settings that we were teaching is the kids actually ended up with worse attitudes about safety than we had in the pretest. And it really dawned on me the problem wasn't the student competencies, it was the competencies of our instructors. And I'm going to sort of walk through that and sort of, youth continue to be an integral part. We all understand that. And if you look at the last week's release of Progressive Farmer or the Successful Farming, and these are what's in there this last week. What's the next one there? This isn't playtime, it's practice, Why I Farm. Next one. All of them, if you look at these coming out, all of them have little kids in them. And they're very powerful ads. These are going to 500,000 homes. And so kids are still a very integral part of agriculture. And our focus has been on these kids so much as to what they need to know. And again, I'm going to try to pull this together. there's been actually little research as to what are the competencies those kids need to have to meet all of these standards that we've established for them. And that was something that we started back when Roger came back, Tormolen came back to Purdue, because he was still interested in that topic, and we began to work on what are the competencies that those kids need to have. And there's a set of materials that I've handed out there, they're on your table, and these are part of the competencies that were developed and validated through a fairly rigorous process involving focus groups, and we used what's called a DACOM process, which actually came out of Canada, but it's been used widely. We've used it for at least 5 or 6 different curriculum projects, and it's an established process of coming up with the core competencies and then the instructional material that relates to them, and then trying to align them with current standards and those kind of things which were done. So if you want to take that and look at it sometime, all of them are on this CD as part of the instructional package that's there, and they're covered for each of the chapters or each of the units that are taught, and so those competencies were identified as things that kids needed to have prior to being engaged. And I can remember when we first started working with an outside funding source concerning this program, is that one of the criteria is that kids could not fail this. And I know Dewey was part of that discussion probably at the time, and it really struck me is that we were mandated that we could not put a failing category in what the kids, as they went through it, would end up falling into. They could not fail. And that troubled us because we felt that there are times that some of them can't get a blue ribbon. I remember the 4-H program where everybody got a blue ribbon. I mean, it was a disaster, quite frankly. But the idea is that every kid should win. Or like our license plate in Indiana says, kids first. But there are times when kids ought not to win. And it's not a failure. It's really a success. When you go through a training program with a group of kids and realize that there's a few of those that probably ought to stay away from anything sharp until they're about 30. Okay? And so it hadn't been done before. We couldn't find it in the literature. There was a clear need because it was essential to develop any kind of an evidence-based curriculum. Most of our curriculums were based on the Standard Oil material developed in the 1950s. And the standard set of competencies were drawn from that material, and it was highly focused on maintenance and repair of farm machinery. It had very little to do with safety, but there was safety woven through it, but it was primarily designed on how to maintain and operate this equipment. It was absolutely essential for measuring success. We couldn't find very much of any kind of evidence to show that if you had developed a certain set of competencies, and then if you measured them, you actually could determine how you achieve that level of success, where we have some kind of matrix that you could determine whether kids have actually completed what you wanted them to complete. And that's what bothers me about online training today, is that you have no way to observe what's going on there. We were trying to make things so efficient and so electronically based that we can pass everybody that completes one of the, if they have enough help or enough time. And the reality is that some of these kids probably shouldn't pass and shouldn't be allowed to be certified. But there was a mindset that you couldn't fail. Every kid who came out to the 4-H tractor driving program should end up with a certificate that they could take and use for employment purposes. I think it's also essential, and that's one of the weak links that, in my personal opinion, is selecting instructors. We have a lot of very good-hearted instructors out there, including ag teachers, and I was one of them, for a while, is that they're not qualified to teach this material. They don't have the training, they don't have the resources, they don't have the passion, and so what we saw was that some of these kids come out of those classes with incorrect understandings of the hazards, or they have attitudes that are reflective of having less interest in being safe than they actually had before the classes were conducted. So I encourage you to look at those competencies that were developed, started out as a Purdue project that was funded by a little bit of money from CDC and then largely funded by USDA for about 10 years. And through that process, we came up with knowledge-based competencies and then performance-based. You can't do those online. And that's something that's required in the law. You cannot be certified under the AgHOs unless somebody observes you operating a piece of machinery. And that is where really the rubber meets the road, is that when you take a youngster, put them on a tractor, and you watch and you find out, as we have seen, some of these kids have never driven before. They got all the knowledge down, but they've never actually have had the opportunity to drive. And our position has been that those kids are not prepared to operate equipment. Somebody needs to take the time. And the AgHO training programs are not a tractor driving school. Never were intended to be that. They're knowledge-based with the opportunity at the end which is required, to observe the kids under operating conditions. Okay. We also set up a set of what we call criteria for the instructors that are teaching these classes. And that's amazing that there's so little literature that's been written about what it takes to teach safety courses. The assumption is, if you read the law, that every ag teacher in America, every extension educator, by law, is qualified to teach these classes. And the reality is that many of them are not qualified. They've never had instruction. We had a PhD student contact every ag ed program in the United States and asked them what they taught with respect to the AgHO training programs or their safety materials, and many of them were clueless about how it was integrated. There's some that turn out ag ed students with actually no safety instruction, looking at the philosophy of safety, the skills that are needed, what are the competencies, what are the risks. Many of these kids that are coming out of ag ed programs have no farm background. And yet they're put in a position of teaching this material. I think it's an unrealistic expectation. So we came up with this list that, using, again, the STACM process with two different teams, one of them being instructors of these AgHO programs, the other being a panel of experts, 249. This has been published in the Journal of Ag Ed. Next one. And this is the panel of experts. There was a very strong alignment between those two groups as to what was required. And again, I can't go through all these in the time we have, but they're available in the publications that we have submitted and been published. Okay? And then there ought to also be competencies. The first set we just saw were criteria. You know, we found that there were kids. I actually went to a tractor program where the instructor was 16 years old. And he was teaching other kids how to be safe, because he was a very articulate kid, and he was teaching, but he had very few tools to operate. And I was just struck by how that's really cool, a 16-year-old kid running this class. And I know that's an exception, but see, we didn't have those kinds of criteria set up, and so I think one of the things we tried to do was to identify what needed to be done. So here's some of the the competencies are in this. Actually, if you look at some of the instructor competencies, they're listed also in here. And again, those have been published in another journal article that we submitted. In conclusion, I think there's a serious disconnect between the expectations that youth be trained to meet all these desired competencies or standards or rules that we've established out there, and then the lack of qualified instructors to do this. So it changed the direction that we took when we were developing this material for USDA, and we began doing a lot of instructor training. We've had about 500 instructors go through this material, briefly run through it, and sometimes we've only had an hour, sometimes we've had 3 or 4 hours. We've done them all around the country, but our desire is to get this stuff in the hands, whatever the curriculum is. And so as of today, we've, Roger and I, we've mailed out about 15,000 copies of this. Every ag teacher in the United States got a copy. Every extension educator got a copy. And over the last 3 years, we've given out about 2,000 copies at the FFA convention. We're going to give out about 500 this week to new teachers that are coming through. And it includes some of the things that we've been talking about today, and that includes an evidence-based approach. It includes an alignment with the standards that are out there, whether it be AF&R or the core curriculum competence standards that are being pushed on by both the feds and the states. It's hard to maneuver that path, mainly because these standards vary quite a bit, and many of them are not measurable. You just can't measure some of the new standards that are coming out. So I will end it. I think that's the last slide, right? Which comes first, the student or the instructor? I think we got to answer that question. Is that right now we're trying to run a program without having instructors. Could you imagine doing that if you were fighting a war and you didn't have anybody, or just driving a truck or car? If everybody got in a car and there were no instructors to provide it. I think we got to really seriously look at that question.